I'm Larry D'Amico, and I'm the curator at the Chappaqua Library, and I've been doing these art talks, as most of you know. And today we're going to do Kandinsky. Vasily Kandinsky was a Russian painter, color theorist, credited as a pioneer in abstract painting. You know, as we humans tend to look for recognizable objects in what we're looking at, abstract painting can be challenging at times. So I'm going to try and bring some degree of understanding to what he was after and why he was pursuing what he pursued. Now, you know, personally, you know, I never really explored Kandinsky in the depth that I have in the past week and a half. There was a exhibition at the Guggenheim about 10 years ago, and you know, it was a good show, but I really didn't plunge in quite as far as I have at this point. There's a lot to be talked about here. Let's see. He was born in 1866 and died in 1944 in France. His childhood was in Odessa, which we call Ukraine now. He graduated from Odessa Art School and then enrolled in the Moscow University studying economics and law. So he was academically quite successful, and he actually was offered a professorship, but he continued to study drawing and painting, and at 30 he decided to dedicate himself to art. So he actually did graduate with an economic and law degree, which is interesting. So his father was a successful tea merchant, and the family was actually fairly, you know, they were fairly well off. It was very stable. His great grandmother was a Mongolian princess, believe it or not. So they were really of the upper class. So what I'm planning to do at this point is move on. Here we go. Color is the keyboard. The eyes are the hammers. The soul is the piano with many strings. The artist is the hand which plays, touching one key or another to cause the vibration in the soul. Okay, so this gives you the first inkling and the first piece of information about his preoccupation. Let me put it this way. The inspiration for artists to do what they do is kind of like the sausage making for this stuff. As an artist, I'm interested in what he's into and what he's thinking about and why he's doing, what the motivation is behind it. For those of us who are just looking at the artwork, this is the experience that we get. Okay, this is what we see. This painting is this painting. Now, he, coming from the background that he came from, he was fascinated with color and symbolism and, you know, kind of the psychological element of what we're observing. And he actually was part of an ethnographic research expedition to north of Moscow. And he related that the houses and churches were decorated with shimmering colors that was like entering into a painting. So this experience of kind of the folk art and the mythology of the Russian heritage was definitely something that intrigued him and brought him to, you know, really deeper exploration. Okay. He left Moscow and went to Munich to study painting at the Munich Academy, and basically he was married at that point, and he went to the Munich Academy because it was a very painterly place to experience paint. They had a very rich kind of tradition at the Munich Academy. So it's this painterly painting that he wanted to experience there. He wanted to learn how to use the materials the way those guys were working with it. And he saw a Monet exhibit there in 1896 and was baffled by this painting. He saw this haystack piece, this grain stack piece, and couldn't take it in, couldn't discern what it was. He saw these big areas of color, and all he experienced was color, big shapes of color. And that really profoundly disturbed and affected him. And it was a real turning point for him. So after that experience, he began to explore color in a very different way. And you can see the folk tales, the folk art influence in these pieces, in these early pieces. By 1906, he was really, you know, he was in his 30s and was teaching. Okay, again, here's a couple of examples of the kinds of things that he would have been seeing or gathering information about from that kind of ethnic background in Russia. Okay, and in 1903, he painted this painting. That was after seeing the Monet and all that. This is the Blue Rider is a very was a very influential and turning point painting for him. You can see the texture, the lusciousness of the paint, but also the color is abstracted. It's not realism. It's not about observation from nature as much as a creating of mood. And the Mirno landscape with greenhouse, he began to look, in looking at this painting, if you can put aside the fact that it's a landscape and just start to look at it as geometric shapes, as circles, squares, rectangles, triangles, and start to look at it as a color experience purely from that point of view, he is beginning to step off into abstraction. And he was exposed to theosophy. Theosophical theory engaged Kandinsky. The notion that creation is a geometrical progression beginning with a single point. The creative aspect of the form is expressed by a descending series of circles, triangles, and squares. Kandinsky's book concerning the spiritual in art, published in 1910, and Point and Line to Plane, published in 1926, echoes this theosophical tenet. So you can really see that he's starting to break down these things and step away from observation from nature. He's still using nature as a matrix to hang these things on, but it's you can see the beginnings of that stepping away from that. And to step back down to earth, this is these are portraits of Gabrielle Munter. By this time, he had separated from his wife. There was a young student in one of his classes, Gabrielle Munter. She was 24, and they traveled together to paint and became more intimately involved, obviously. So these two portraits, and there are several others, are really portraits of her. And let's see. Yeah, so he was with her. He met her in Munich, and then they went out to Murnau together and painted together. Now, she was a wonderful artist herself. And on the right is Boating by Gabrielle Munter. And the central figure in this is Kandinsky, the guy with the beard. That's Kandinsky. On the left is Large Blue Horses by Franz Marc. And Marc, Munter, and Kandinsky banded together with several other artists to create what was called the Blue Rider School, actually. As you can see, Franz Marc liked blue horses too, so they were simpatico. So also involved with the Blue Rider group, they actually started a gallery in Munich, and on the left is Juletsky, in the middle is August Macke, and on the right is a painting by Paul Klee. They were all involved in this group, and this was early. This was pre-German Expressionism. These guys were actually the beginning of what became a very large and much more severe school. These paintings are much more lyrical than the kind of severity and sharpness and anger that is expressed in many of the paintings that were to follow. And now many of these were painted pre-World War I. This was started in 1911, so it was pre-World War I, and so these guys really communicated with each other, and Paul Klee and Kandinsky were to remain lifelong friends. They and I'll talk more about that later. Basically they taught and worked together at what is called the Bauhaus. And again, I'm going to talk more about that. Okay. In 1911, Kandinsky went to a concert, and I think I have talked about synesthesia at another point, so I will talk a little bit more about that right now. Basically, the relationship between sound and color is something that many artists have explored from this time and actually before this time. The correlation between color and something as abstract as sound kind of relate to one another for many artists, and synesthesia is actually something which some people experience directly, neurologically, the connections between color and sound cross over. And so this painting was painted after Kandinsky heard a concert, and he was so moved by it. He saw these colors emanating from the sound that was in the concert. So he painted this, not while the music was going.
So Larry, we have a comment in chat.
Okay. Yes.
From Roberta Lasky. I don't know if you can see it. Interesting. These paintings look like Picasso's Woman with Yellow Hair.
Okay. Well, there's actually a relationship between Picasso and Matisse and what's going on with Kandinsky. Though look at the date here. We're talking 1911. This is early on. So yes. There's definitely, he was aware of Picasso. He'd been in Paris, Gabrielle Munter, and he went there and basically knew what was going on in the avant-garde in Paris too. So yeah, good question though. Thank you. So I'm gonna move on. I talked about synesthesia before when we did Joan Mitchell, who actually experienced a synesthesia that was with her most of her life and had a hard time discerning certain things, sound and color and things like that. So this is actually something which people directly experience, along with a kind of intellectual sensitivity to this. There's actually connections, neurological connections that happen. I don't know much about this. It's definitely worth exploring though. And thinking about music and art and improvisation, it's something that comes in with the jazz, with the abstract expressionists. They were listening to Bird and Miles Davis and knocking that paint around. But there's people like Stuart Davis who love music, and Mondrian, Broadway boogie woogie. So there's all these relationships to music. Paul Klee, again, was a wonderful musician. He played Bach every morning. He was somebody who was a wonderful musician, and that played a very important part in his music. And to be sure, Kandinsky and Klee talked about this. Okay. Now, improvisation. And if you look to the right, you see this is a sketch for improvisation number 20. He didn't just knock these things out. He would explore the theme and play around with earlier sketches, and then do a larger scale piece out of that development of that theme. And black lines, yeah. It's like musical notations. There's some ephemeral score going on here. So there's a play between these black lines and this field of color blooming in the background. Okay. This is an enormous piece. This is 78 by 120 inches. It's a gigantic piece. It's very apocalyptic. It's, you know, there's landscape references still in it. You can kind of discern horses or people or various shapes that appear to be mountains or sky or the sun. There's a lot of things. There's birds flying through it if you look for them. But one of the things that's going on also is this red and green kind of clash. Like I said, it's a very apocalyptic piece. Now look at the date. It's 1913. We're getting very close to the war. There's a lot of turmoil in and strife in society that's going on there. Now, was he directly painting about that? I don't know. I don't know what he would say about that. I haven't read enough about this piece and about his thinking about it, but I read that into it, and it's kind of sensing the forces at play on a planetary level. World War I is on its way. So they're at war. He is an enemy alien in Germany, so he has to go back to Russia. He did smaller works at this stage of the game, a lot of turmoil in Russia too. And he began to teach. He I believe he had a professorship at Moscow. I'm not 100% certain about that one, but I'm pretty sure about that. He left Gabrielle Munter in Germany, and when he moved back to Russia, she would play a very important role in saving and storing the artwork by a number of the artists that were involved with the Blue Rider group. She had those paintings in her possession and stored them in her home in Murnau, and in actuality salvaged them through World War II, when the Nazis were looking for that kind of nasty, degenerate art to destroy or sell. She hid the work, so she played a very big part. Wonderful artist, though. She doesn't get enough play, as far as I'm concerned. I've explored her work, and well worth looking her up and Google search her work. Anyway, by 1916, Kandinsky meets a young woman. She's 19, 18, and he's 47 by that time, and they marry in 1917. So let's see. Okay. This is by 1920. The Russian Revolution has taken place. He is in Moscow now. He has an international reputation at that point, and so the Communist Party is not so well established that they don't want to take advantage of something like that. So he actually plays a kind of important role in the cultural activity and cultural development at that time. There were a number of painters that were there that were really radical in their approach. Kazimir Malevich, and several other avant-garde painters, along with Kandinsky, were in Moscow and were, still allowed to do their work and allowed to explore that radical work abstraction. But by 1923, actually by 1921, I believe it was, the artwork that the state wanted was really about propaganda, and although Kandinsky was respected and influential and in a good position, the wealth of his family had been confiscated. The property that they owned, they owned many properties, and the wealth, much of the wealth of his family had been confiscated by the state. He was contacted by a architect by the name of Gropius, who was starting a new school. And now we're going to start to talk about Walter Gropius invited Kandinsky to a new school that he was creating called the Bauhaus in Germany. And the timing was perfect for Kandinsky to get the heck out of Moscow, because things had turned. So he taught at the Bauhaus. Actually, Paul Klee was also one of the fellow teachers there, and so they were interacting again. So I'm going to talk a little bit about this painting, because it's a lovely painting, worth exploring a bit and talking a little bit about what's going on here. So some of Kandinsky's color theories are exemplified in this work. You'll notice that there are these kind of overlaps and layering going on in this painting. If you look up in the upper left-hand corner, I put up a color wheel, and you see red and green are opposites. They're complementary colors on the color wheel, and that's that oppositional business. So if you look at this painting, there's this red-green dominant that's going on in the more active circles, and you can see how, at least I see, and you observe your own observation, the red seems to come forward, seems to hover more, come out at us, and the greens seem to recede. Okay, if you can see that, and these move through space. I mean, you can see how, basically there's the scale of the circles are different as you look at it, and they play in the space in different ways. And then there's this black linear element which moves the eye around the composition. This is all really, part of what Kandinsky was teaching, was disseminating to his students, and talking about in this situation. I'll say a little bit more about the Bauhaus. The Bauhaus was a really, really interesting concept. It had never been done before. It's the integration of architecture, art, and craft. So basically there was design, basically objects, design, furniture, all of that was integrated together with architecture painting, all these things were drawn together in this school, and it lasted from 1921 until 1933, when the Nazis came into power, I believe, was the end of it. Okay, I'm going to move on. Okay, now, Kandinsky and Malevich and Mondrian are credited as the exemplars of abstract painting, but Hilma af Klint began creating radically abstract paintings in 1906. They were like little that had been seen before. Bold, colorful, untethered from any recognizable references to the physical world. It was years before Kandinsky, Malevich, Mondrian, and others would take similar strides to rid their artwork of representational content. So, you know, she was, again, one of the people that was involved with Theosophy. And so these notions of kind of these higher realms of spiritual planes and all that stuff, I'm not saying, I'm just saying that's the sausage. That's the sausage making. That was the inspiration for this stuff. It was really where the thoughts, she would do kind of a seance sort of thing, and allow these spirits to come through her to create the images that she was working with for these pieces. So there's kind of also this kind of subatomic theoretical physics, the kind of nature as metaphor for the unseen world, the microcosm, macrocosm business going on with her, and with Kandinsky on some level. So let's see. So again, the circle, claimed Kandinsky, is the synthesis of the greatest oppositions. It combines the concentric and the eccentric in a single form and in equilibrium. Of the three primary forms, it points most clearly to the fourth dimension, whatever that means. It's really mysterious. It's celestial. It's cellular. It's a very interesting play that's going on here. Okay. Okay. And for me, this is a really beautiful kind of balanced piece. It's got this sense of balance in movement, of form and color. For me, it's a tranquil piece. Someone else might see it differently. So I love the piece. And again, now we're dealing with red, yellow, red, blue. So it's the three primary colors that are that he's essentially going down to in this piece. It's a large piece. It's 50 by 79, so it's a fairly substantial piece. There's the interaction of the primary colors. There's this business of the grid as a structure. There's also the beginnings of this interplay between the severe sharp line and form playing against a kind of biomorphic form. So you see these kind of straight lines against squiggles. So there's also movement that's created by these arcs throughout the composition. And as I said before, pieces like this, I don't have any of the sketches for this, but you can bet that he worked out a lot of these ideas before he approached this painting. Let me see where we are. All right. Three sounds. Again, we're back to the synesthesia business. The idea or reference to sound in color form is something that he makes constant reference to in a lot of these things. They're named composition as opposed to painting. They're named improvisation. You know, so these are references to music. I mean, he did play. He played the piano and I believe the bass or something like that. I can't remember what all he played, but he did play. I don't think he was quite as developed in that as Clay was, but okay. And a glow. So this is a watercolor in the ink and graphite. Not very big, but you can see him working on these ideas. And if any of you are familiar with Paul Klee's work, you can see the playfulness that's starting to, you know, come into these pieces. They're very expansive, okay? You know, these arrows pointing off the edges of the composition, they kind of like give you an implication that the universe is much bigger than this little square. Okay, upward. What's this about? It's more of a figure of reference because I see a portrait, I see a head in there. But there's also this architectonic shape at the bottom, which kind of arrows up into the neck or into the head. You know, the split in the circle kind of pushes the composition up, so it's got this buoyance and this sense of upward motion out of it. And notice the background. I mean, basically, I haven't been drawing your attention to that, but he does these big fields of color and they have very muted transitions happening all over the place. So this field of color thing is something which is being explored by a lot of painters, Miro and Paul Klee, and a number of others. And it especially comes into the US in a lot of the abstract painters that become abstract expressionist painters. And speaking of Paul Klee, we have this piece, and buoyant. This playful quality in Klee's work is something which, you know, basically this dialogue between Klee and Kandinsky has been going on, as I said, from the Blue Rider through the Bauhaus and beyond. So we need to really acknowledge that, and, you know, and the playful quality, you know, you can begin to see some of the folk art forms that Kandinsky was looking at as a younger man come out in these pieces. they've been there, but you can see sort of that sort of patterning and some of that toll painting patterning happening in these pieces. And this is, again, this is a large piece. It's from 1939, so this is late in his career, where, you know, it's 51 by 77. And so, you know, again, composition. You can see the bird-like shapes, you know, down in this lower. Let me see. Let me do this. Zoom in. You know, you can see the bird-like shapes in here. And so this is back to the toll painting and back to the reference to the folk art in Russia and folk art in general. I mean, basically, he was looking at African art and pre-Columbian art and all this stuff. He had kind of an encyclopedic collection of patterns and reference material that he took with him from place to place. By now he's in France, so he's painting in Paris. So he's right in the middle of really everything. Now this is the beginning of the war. You know, basically he stayed in Paris and was there through the end of his life. As I was saying, you know, the folk art is echoed in these pieces, and you can see that. You can see sort of the biomorphic symbols that are playing out in these pieces. Let me do this. Let me do a close up on this. Zoom in. You know, you see this little guy in here, and this little guy dancing around over here. So there's you know. And then there's kind of, you know, subatomic particles. There's you know, protozoa dancing around in here. There's all kinds of stuff going on. He was an educated man. He was somebody who was aware of what was going on in art and in science. And again, I want to draw your attention to the background in this painting, this reciprocal accords, music, sound, but also look at that background. Look at that subtle violet on the left in the background, and that pale green down the center, and then this beautiful kind of yellow tinge on the right. You know, it's very interesting, very subtle, nuanced painting.
Hey Larry, we have in chat from Roberta Lasky.
Yes.
A question: was Moreau influenced by Kandinsky?
It went both ways. In fact, I'm gonna talk about that in a little while, but more than happy that you brought it up. Yes, absolutely, he was influenced, and Jean Arp and a number of other people were all influenced by Kandinsky, but he was also there in Paris, and he was looking at what these young artists were doing. So in fact, the influence went back and forth. Good question, though. Thank you. Okay, and talk about biomorphic forms and the grid. So basically, you know, it's kind of a catalog of forms, of a language that he's developing. This group of squiggles and jellyfish dancing around. they're very interesting. They're very interactive. It's figure ground business. If you're familiar with what I mean by that, the interaction between the edge of the square and the shape of the marking inside of it is as important as the shape itself. So figure ground is like, okay, let me do this. I'm going to close in on one so I can give you a, whoop, sorry, didn't mean to do that. Giving away my secrets. Here we go. I'm going to go close in on this one right here. Okay, so this piece in the center, you know, if you look at it, the shapes around, the black shapes around this jellyfish-like shape are as active as the jellyfish itself. In fact, if you focus on the black comes forward and becomes prominent. If you focus on the white, the black shifts down and goes into the background, and the jellyfish becomes dominant. So this is what I mean by figure ground. It's that face vase business that I showed you a while back. If you guys have been following me over time, I've talked about figure ground before. So this is, okay, here we go. So, you know, and again, it's really kind of biomorphic figures, but it's developing a language of symbol. And here they are set free, breaking out of the grid and dancing around across the surface of the painting. And here's another kind of architectonic dance in the sunshine. This is you know, my personal take on this. You may see something totally different, but you know, basically, it's a very wacky, buoyant interaction of shape. Very architectural, and at the same time, very active, very moving. And 4 figures on 3 squares. Again, I talked a little bit about the African motif. Well, I see that in this. There's this rhythmic beat that's in the piece. It was a very subtle sort of thing. I mean, you see these 3 squares behind it, and the surface on these pieces, and I wish I had talked more about that earlier, which I will do right now and zoom in a little bit. These surfaces, well, it's a little bit hard to see in this one because the picture is not quite as crisp as I'd like it to be, but he used sand mixed in with the paint, and it gives it this sort of grit and shimmer that these flat areas would lack. It's something that someone like Georges Braque used a lot. Those flat surfaces in his still lives are often activated by sand mixed in with the paint. And Kandinsky adopted that technique. And who knows, he may have seen it in Braque and followed that and used it for his pieces. Okay, and This is 1943. By this time, the Surrealists were really the dominant avant-garde force in Europe. Kandinsky was sort of passé in the European avant-garde, but there were certain people that really appreciated his work, and Solomon Guggenheim happened to be one of them. And he bought, and I don't know how many he bought. I think he bought in the hundreds of Kandinsky's pieces. The Guggenheim Museum now houses, they've got over 50. So the show that's on now is from within their collection. The museum itself was called the Museum of Non-Objective Art before Guggenheim contributed the entire collection of his Kandinsky's to the museum, and they changed the name of the museum in honor of that bequest. So interesting little factoid. Okay, and now, speaking of all those other artists who were influenced by Kandinsky, in the upper left-hand corner is Jean Arp, and basically he did these three-dimensional pieces. He was doing these from way back there, 1917. So who influenced who? Kandinsky would have known Jean Arp's work. So basically, there was definitely a relationship there. And if you look at the Jean Miro was definitely doing this in 1924. And Kandinsky's work, who influenced who? Well, Kandinsky was doing those geometric pieces at that point. So he would have gone to Paris, he would have seen Miro's work. So did Miro influence Kandinsky? Did Kandinsky influence Miro? We don't know. I think it goes both ways. I think that's how it is. Below, in the center, is Sophie I'm gonna botch this name, Tober Arp, who was married to Jean Arp, and her work is just terrific. And there's going to be a big show, and I'm going to do a talk about her at the Museum of Modern Art coming up. And they were quite the couple. She died, I think, earlier than he, but I'm not 100% certain about that. I'll know more when I get to it. But you can see the non-objective art and see, she was really out there on the edge in 1931. Alexander Calder, again, big abstract shapes. Definitely Miro and he were friends. They knew each other. They knew Kandinsky's work. Joseph Albers and Annie Albers on the right. They both were at the Bauhaus. Annie Albers did this weaving at the Bauhaus. So they knew Kandinsky well. They interacted with him all the time. Gorgeous, beautiful stuff. And then there's people like Max Ernst, who was a surrealist, but also was doing these abstracted organic forms. And then if you transfer that across to America and look at the abstract expressionists and look at the things that came out of that, you can definitely see the influence of Kandinsky, the influence of these folks on the beginnings of abstract expressionism. There are a number of painters who were straight out of this. De Kooning and let's see, Gorky, of course, organic forms, abstracted fields of color. This is the influences crossing the ocean to America are straight out of this. Okay, and we're going to finish up with art is born from the inner necessity of the artist in an enigmatic, mystical way through which it acquires an autonomous life. It becomes an independent subject animated by a spiritual breath. Okay. So that's our story. This show is opening as of today. It's on through September of 2022, so you got plenty of time to get there to see it. And so let's see, are there any questions at this stage of the game? Doesn't look like it. Okay, so I'll see you all in 2 weeks. Thank you very much.